folks. We've been studying, to get started with our class, we've been studying in the book of Samuel. We've studied Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and now we have begun in the book of Samuel. I've said this several times, but I'll say it for someone who may not have heard me say this, or maybe is visiting. We call this study, a lot of times it's referred to as Hebrew history, or Hebrew history 1 and 2, depending on how you want to break it up, or sometimes people just go through the whole thing. But I also know that some people don't like history. So I said, if you don't like history, if you know, sometimes certain people hear history and they think boring. So if history bores you, then we're calling this study a study of the former prophets. But if history is your thing, I love history personally. So if that's your thing, then we're studying Hebrew history. So however you want to word it. But we're in the book of Samuel. We closed out last week with chapter 1, with the birth of Samuel. And let me find my note that I had made. I wanted to mention one other thing, or a couple of things from chapter 1. Sometimes you go back over your notes after the fact and you realize that you forgot to mention something. One of the things that I find intriguing here in chapter 1, of course, Hannah is praying. Eli sees her, and what happens? What transpires there? He thinks she's drunk, and he goes and rebukes her. And of course, I think we did mention last week that there's kind of a lesson to be learned there. Be careful about assuming too much, and there are things that certainly appear. It's not like you're just jumping to a wild conclusion. But here, just because someone's lips are moving, their mouth is moving, but you can't hear them speaking, that seems like kind of a jump, doesn't it? I mean, to assume she was drunken. And so that's what I wanted to mention. Why does Eli see someone with the mouth moving, but you can't hear him speaking, and assume drunkenness? It makes me wonder, was he expecting to see drunken women at the doorpost of the tabernacle? We're going to learn later on in the next chapter that his sons were anything but godly men. These were vile men. So it may very well be that this had happened before. Again, it doesn't make it okay just for him necessarily to jump to that conclusion right offhand. But you ever thought about that? I mean, maybe that's why. Maybe this had happened before. Maybe his sons had brought women consuming alcohol and things like that right there at the doorpost of the temple or tabernacle in those days. It may be that somebody has said, I don't know that this one holds much weight with me, but one fellow said maybe his eyesight was so poor he couldn't see clearly. I don't know that I'm buying that, because he saw her mouth moving, right? If he could see well enough to see her mouth moving but not hear anything, I don't know that explains it. And going right with the first one that we mentioned, someone asked the question, were the spiritual conditions so poor that you could just expect to meet drunken people just about anywhere? That might be the case. But whatever the reason, that's what he assumed. He rebukes her and finds out she has prayed to God. Samuel, I think we mentioned this last week, Shemuel, it means heard of God. Some people have this asked of God, but best I can tell, the more accurate translation of the name is heard of God. God heard her prayer, and he answered. It's from the same base word, at least, as Shema, which is famous for, in the book of Deuteronomy, hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. But it starts off with Shema, and sometimes it's even just referred to as the Shema. Hear, O Israel. So Samuel, heard of God. I didn't mention this last week, but I think we just kind of touched on it. In verse 22 of chapter 1, it says, she's not going to go up until the child is weaned. We obviously, in our culture, in our time, view weaning as it's a lot earlier and sometimes different. What she's referring to here clearly is it may be kind of an extended use of that term, even for her, but what she's obviously referring to is, I'm going to wait until this child can care for himself. Not necessarily waiting until he's an adult, because obviously he goes to the temple very young, but at least old enough where he can fix a meal for himself and things like that. So a lot of scholars speculate, and at the end of the day, we don't know exactly what age, but maybe 7, 8 years of age, something like that, might even be getting toward 10. So that's clearly what she's talking about. She wants to be able to go and leave him and know that he can, obviously Samuel or Eli is going to help him in a lot of ways, but that he can, be able to be very helpful there at the tabernacle. There's also something interesting. Is it 22? Let me see. That's what I've got in my notes, but I didn't think that was the right verse. Yes, it is. It's the very last part of verse 22. She says, I'm not going to go up until the child be weaned, then I'll bring him that he may appear before the Lord and there abide forever. Now, sometimes you see this word forever, or it's in the King James it's 2 words, but in our English it's 1. But this word forever, you'll sometimes see this in both Testaments, but a lot in the Old Testament. It doesn't always mean like forever and ever, eternally. What she's talking about here is referring to he's going to be a servant of God at the tabernacle the rest of his life. That is what she means by that. But she's obviously not meaning for eternity, because he's going to leave this life at some point. I just say that to point out that just like we do, they use that term pretty flexibly, that word. What's the example that we've given over and over again, a modern day example with the word forever? I'm glad you gave that example, brother. Somebody might say, I've been married forever. We might, sometimes we even use it even more flexibly than that. Sometimes you'll come home and you'll say, what? Maybe you get home and, where have you been? You said you were just going to run to Walmart. And you say, I had to wait in line forever. And we use that term in a very exaggerated way many times. You might say, sometimes somebody will ask me, how long has that preacher been at such and such a place? And it may be somebody who's been preaching in the same congregation for, 15, 20 years, sometimes longer than that. So, oh man, he's been there forever. So, we use that term pretty flexibly. And I point that out to say this. I know we're not studying Seventh-day Adventism in this particular class, but there are times in the Bible when God will talk about the Sabbath day as a sign with Israel forever. And it's very obvious that meant for the duration of the Mosaic covenant. That was something that was given specifically to Israel. And you'll even find in the book of Jonah, in Jonah chapter 2, Jonah's swallowed by this great fish. And he talks about how he prayed to God from the belly of the fish. And he asked God to deliver him. And he's talking about how the fish took him down into the very depths of the ocean. And he says, the earth with her bars was about me forever. I'm surrounded by this prison. The earth had become a prison for me, the depths of the earth, forever. And yet, how long does the Bible tell us Jonah was in the fish's belly? 3 days and 3 nights, right? So it wasn't forever. Sometimes even God will use the term forever, speaking to Israel, and we're going to see this in the case of Eli with his sons. Eli was supposed to have the priesthood for how long? Eli and his line. Forever, right? Now, even that would have meant just to the end of the Mosaic dispensation, because there's going to be a changing of the priesthood, which means a changing of the law when Jesus comes along. He's from the tribe of Judah, of course. And Hebrews talks about that. But what's going to end up happening in chapter 3, when Samuel is called, and Eli finally figures this out and says, next time you hear the voice call you, you say, speak, Lord, thy servant hears. And God is going to tell Eli, I'm cutting off the priesthood from your line. And If we took that word forever so literally every single time, we'd have to say, oh, time out. You said forever, Lord. Even there, forever meant conditionally. And that's important, because what will happen is you fast forward several thousand years, and people even today will say things like Israel has a right, a God-given right to that land, talking about over in Palestine. And you know, there are all these battles over territory in the Middle East, and particularly right around Israel and Jerusalem. Whose is it? You know, and sometimes people will say, God says it's Israel's. God said, past tense, at one time it was Israel's. That was a conditional promise. And of course, they didn't hold up their end of the bargain. So even with the priesthood, God says to Eli over in chapter 3, and I know I'm getting ahead, but he uses that term, or he had previously used that term forever, but there was a stipulation there. It was conditional. So just, you know, remember that when you read the word forever, and again, I know it's two words in the old King James, but that term, we'll put it that way, that term forever, remember when you read that, you know, look at your context and look at the immediate context, look at the overall biblical context, and see what is that word referring to. So I wanted to mention that as well. Now let's go into chapter 2. This is Hannah's, basically her song. You're going to see Samuel begin his service to the Lord, but Hannah sings this song, and what you're going to find in this is that a lot of this, as you read through it, will seem completely irrelevant to Hannah's situation, but there's a point here, and the song is just a song of praise for God taking care of his people, answering prayers and things like that, and helping them in difficult circumstances. So the theme of the song is stressing the power, the sovereignty, the judgment of God. And so you see, you know, like in verse 1, my heart rejoiceth in the Lord. Mine horn is exalted in the Lord. Horn is many times used in Hebrew poetry representing strength. My mouth is enlarged over my enemies because I rejoice in thy salvation. And, you know, she's going to mention salvation. You know, sometimes you read this, you think, you know, what does this have to do with her having this child? But she's just praising God for his provision and answering her prayer and helping her. And so she's just, you know, it's as if she just breaks out into a song of praise. And so there'll even be a reference in here to her having other children later. I was looking for that. I just lost the spot. But anyway, there's a reference to that. So then you get to verse 11. Elkanah went to Ramah to his house, and the child did minister unto the Lord before Eli the priest. So now Samuel is ministering to or serving Eli the priest. Now we get this commentary on Eli's sons. This divine commentary is how God viewed the sons of Eli. They were sons of Belial. This is a term that is sometimes used in Scripture in the Old Testament, particularly to indicate very, very wicked people. It's almost like saying sons of Satan. They were just extremely ungodly men. The priest's custom with the people was when they offered sacrifice, the priest's servant came while the flesh was in seething with a flesh hook of 3 teeth in his hand. It's a meat hook. It's got 3 teeth. Of course, sometimes people say, why 3 teeth? Well, just you get more meat that way. And he struck it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. All that the flesh hook brought up, the priest took for himself. So they did in Shiloh unto all the Israelites that came thither. Up to this point, that's okay. That's authorized by the law of Moses. And we won't go and read all those verses, but all of that was fine. That was the way it was supposed to be. But here is where they go astray. Also, before they burnt the fat, the priest's servant came and said to the man that sacrificed, give flesh to roast for the priest, for he will not have sodden flesh of thee, but raw. And if any man said unto him, let them not fail to burn the fat presently, and then take as much as thy soul desireth, then he would answer him, nay, but thou shalt give it to me now, and if not, I will take it by force. So here are these priests, and they come along, and they would take these three-pronged meat hooks, bring up the meat. But that was all okay. But now they're saying, oh, we want the raw meat. I don't know if they didn't like the way the person cooked it. We're not told. And somebody would say, here's somebody who's trying to do things the right way, the way the Lord said, and they say, hey, time out. Let me burn the fat. Let me do it the way it's supposed to be. And the guy says, no. You can give it to me, or I can take it from you. So, can you imagine what that must have been like? You go, and here's the priest who's threatening you if you don't give him that flesh, that meat. Wherefore, verse 17, the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord. They abhorred the Lord's offering because they love themselves. That's what it comes down to. You love yourself, you abhor the Lord. And not to say that you can't care for yourself, but they had elevated themselves above God. They were doing what they wanted, bottom line. But Samuel ministered before the Lord, being a child, girded with a linen ephod. So Samuel, in contrast to the sons of Eli, is the idea here in verse 18. You've got these wicked men who are engaged in all more in the verses to follow, but over here you've got Samuel, and he's serving the Lord faithfully. You could say about that, but one thing we can say is that just because everybody else is doing it doesn't mean it's okay, right? And just because someone in a position of authority or a position of prominence or someone we might typically look up to is doing something wrong doesn't mean it's okay. We see someone in a position, in kind of an elevated so-called position, do something, and if we think if we just knock it down a little bit, we can say, well, at least I'm not like that. But here's Samuel. He doesn't do any of that. He's just serving God. His mother made him a little coat, brought it to him from year to year when she came up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifices. So Eli blessed Elkanah and his wife and said, the Lord give thee seed of this woman for the loan which is lent to the Lord. And they went into their home. So Hannah has other children, 3 sons, 2 daughters. Verse 21, the child Samuel grew before the Lord. So Samuel continues to grow. Eli is old, verse 22 tells us. He heard all his sons did with all Israel, or did unto all Israel, how they lay with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. Again, this might be one explanation as to why he sees Hannah and assumes she's drunken. This may be, it may have become not all that uncommon for women to show up drunk at the tabernacle looking for Eli's sons. That's just how bad those young men were. He does say to his sons, verse 23, why do ye such things? For I hear of your evil dealings by all this people. Nay, my sons, for it is no good report that I hear. You make the Lord's people to transgress. If one man sin against another, the Lord, the judge, shall judge him. But if a man sin against the Lord, who shall entreat for him? Notwithstanding, they hearken not unto the voice of their father, because the Lord would slay them. Probably better translated, therefore the Lord was going to slay them. Samuel, though, again contrasted. Verse 26 says, grew on and was in favor both with the Lord and also with men. I have a note in my notes. Another lesson we learn here is that just because someone is working in God's service doesn't necessarily mean he's right with God. Preachers can make mistakes. Elders can make mistakes. Deacons can make mistakes. Even beyond that, preachers, elders, and deacons do make mistakes. But let's face the cold, hard reality. Sometimes preachers, elders, deacons can be, almost for lack of a better term, leading a double life, right? It doesn't make it okay. But just because someone is in a position of being full-time in the Lord's service doesn't mean that it automatically follows that person is right with God. And some people act like they could just overlook something if here's someone, maybe they're a full-time preacher, maybe they're an elder, or whatever they might be doing, and just almost overlook that. Sometimes the person can begin to feel that way. I remember Brother Bobby Liddell telling us one time in preaching school, he said, listen, I don't even remember what we were studying at the time, but he said, let me tell you young men something, and you older men too. So we had a few older men in our class. he said, God doesn't owe you some sin in your life. Sometimes you get to feeling like, well, I've sacrificed a lot for the Lord. I've been preaching. Maybe here's a church that paid me next to nothing, and my family's living on peanuts. Or maybe it's a situation where you just really you've put in a lot of time and a lot of effort, and really feel like you've sacrificed for the Lord. He doesn't owe you sin to compensate for that. God doesn't do comp time with here's you a pass. All of us are going to stand before the same God and answer based on the same standard. So just because someone is full-time in the service of God doesn't mean that person necessarily is right with God. Also, just because a person has a parent in a prominent position doesn't necessarily follow that the children are going to be faithful, right? Sometimes the children of preachers go astray. True or false? It's true. What about elders' children? Sometimes they do, don't they? Some of the most heartbreaking, gut-wrenching moments are seeing situations where maybe an elder steps down because there's something going on with a child living in his house, and he's become so rebellious and so ungodly, and he says, hey, I need to work this out, but I can't be shepherding the congregation with that going on, or things like that. It happens. Just because the parents are faithful or in a position of leadership or a prominent position doesn't necessarily mean that the children are going to follow. So these men, these sons of Eli, and y'all just bear with me because I don't know what it is when I study and teach and talk about Eli and Samuel in this section of the book of 1 Samuel. Sometimes, try as I may, I will end up saying Samuel for Eli. For probably 3 or 4 months when we were at Greens Lake Road in Chattanooga, I had a Pew Packers question. It's on a flashcard. What's the name of the judge that didn't restrain his children? And I mean, it was like clockwork. The kids were saying, Samuel, because it was on the card. And I knew it was Eli. So you talk about difficult, because now I got to go back and reteach the children. No, it's not Samuel. Sorry, preacher messed that one up. But sometimes I'm thinking Eli and Samuel comes out, or vice versa. So just, I've almost said it like 3 times today. I think I caught myself each time, but just bear with me. If you hear me say that and you think that doesn't sound right, well, check it with the book, and it may not be. But these sons of Eli, their sin was so great due to their lack of respect for the sacrifice. And really, we can go beyond that and say their lack of respect for God himself. If you and we don't reverence and respect God, then we start having these ideas as if, well, I can get a pass on this, or I can get a pass on that, or it doesn't really matter about this. That comes down to a lack of respect for God. So there's another lesson here, I think, that the people, have you ever thought about this? If you were just one of the, I don't know any other way to say it. I'm not trying to say anything negative toward those people, but just one of the regular old people of Israel. And maybe you're sitting at home talking to your family, maybe to your wife, to your husband, to your children, and you say, well, it's time to go up for the yearly feast. And maybe your spouse says, well, you know what's going to happen. Those awful sons of Eli, they're going to come, and they're going to threaten us, and they're going to take that meat when it hasn't even been cooked. And maybe your spouse says, I think we should just not go. Now, what do you do? Did the people still have a responsibility? You can't control what those priests do, right? But they still have a responsibility to follow when God said to go up for the feast, when God said to offer the sacrifice. I don't answer for someone else. And sometimes that'll happen. Maybe it's a preacher, an elder, whatever. Maybe they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. I've seen situations where it might be a preacher, it might be an elder, it might not even be an elder, it might just be maybe it's someone who's wealthy or prominent, and they get kind of a figurative stranglehold on the congregation, and people start saying, well, I'm just not going to go. I'm going to withhold my contribution. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But just because someone else isn't doing right doesn't mean I can suddenly say, well, I don't think I'm going to do right either. Because two wrongs don't make it right. And so the people still had an obligation here. But it certainly makes it frustrating, doesn't it? If you know you're supposed to go to offer your sacrifice, but you also know that he's going to just basically steal it from you. And it wasn't that the people wanted that food, that they wanted that meat. They're just trying to, many of them, just trying to follow the law, follow what God had said to do. But here come these young men, and they're determined they're going to have their way. So it really, really is sad, unfortunate. So, where did we leave off? Samuel, again, contrasted with Eli's sons, growing in favor both with the Lord and also with men. Verse 26, now there comes a man of God unto Eli, and speaks pretty plainly. Thus saith the Lord, did I plainly appear into the house of thy father when they were in Egypt in Pharaoh's house? And did I choose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to offer upon mine altar, to burn incense, to wear an ephod before me? Did I give into the house of thy father all the offerings made by fire of the children of Israel? Wherefore kick ye at my sacrifice and at mine offering, which I have commanded in my habitation, and honorest thy sons above me? My people. It says you kick at my sacrifice. God, it's the idea of rebel. You just, there's a term that will be used in the book of Malachi. This will be centuries later, but it's the term snuff at it. And we might say scoff at it. I think probably the most accurate thing I can think of is, sometimes as a teenager I'd get just about slapped across the face for it. But sometimes it'll happen even now with young folks, and sometimes with older folks. Somebody says something, and you just go, pfft. That's kind of the idea of snuffing at it. And here's, in Malachi, he's talking about Israel. They were going through the motions of worship, but it's just kind of like, oh, it's Sabbath day. Guess we got to go to worship. Guess we got to go offer this sacrifice. Is this Sabbath day over yet? I got business to tend to. They were ready to go make their money. When's it going to be over? What a weariness is it? And you snuffed at it, just. And that's what God equates Eli's inaction with his sons to, is kicking at it, snuffing at it, just kind of going, what can you do? And God says, I expect you to do something, Eli. So he says, the Lord God of Israel saith, I said indeed that thy house, we touched on this just a while ago in the beginning of class, and the house of thy father should walk before me forever. But now the Lord saith, be it far from me. For them that honor me I will honor, and them that despise me shall be lightly esteemed. I think I attributed this to Samuel's vision, but it's actually God sending another prophet to Eli, sending a prophet to Eli. Then he says, behold, the days come that I will cut off thine arm and the arm of thy father's house, that there shall not be an old man in thine house. Well, he's not talking about cutting off his arm literally. It's a figurative use there, obviously. We'll see some of this happen in chapter 4. We'll see some of this happen later on when Saul is going to slaughter a bunch of priests. King Saul, I mean. Verse 32, thou shalt see an enemy in thy habitation, in my habitation, in all the wealth which God shall give Israel, and there shall not be an old man in thine house forever. And the man of thine whom I shall not cut off from mine altar shall be to consume thine eyes and to grieve thine heart. And all the increase of thine house shall die in the flower of their age. This shall be a sign unto thee that shall come upon thy two sons, on Hophni and Phinehas. In one day they shall die, both of them. Again, we'll see that in chapter 4. And I will raise me up a faithful priest, that shall do according to that which is in mine heart and in my mind, and I will build him a sure house, and he shall walk before mine anointed forever. Has anybody got a little star or asterisk or anything indicating messianic there in your Bibles? Anybody? I don't have it in mine. It seems to be messianic. I don't know that we can say that with 100% certainty. Some versions, or not versions, some editions of Bibles will have marks of some kind when there's a messianic. Like go to Isaiah 53, and every verse of Isaiah 53 would have that star. My old preaching school Bible, it would just have a star out at the end of the verse. But anyways, I just said that to point out that possibly it certainly seems like messianic. Sometimes it's hard to say 100% for certain. And I also said that to point out that if you do have an edition of the Bible that does that, just bear in mind that the stars are not inspired. And sometimes people put something down as messianic that's not. And in fact, there are places in my old preaching school Bible where there's a star, and you can see where I took my pen and put an X through it because I studied it and realized in the context there's no way that's messianic. This one seems to be, but it's hard to say 100% for sure. They're just scattered throughout the Old Testament, and it's very interesting how God just drops these messianic prophecies all along the way, if indeed this is one of those. But he says, "It shall come to pass that every one that is left in thine house," talking to Eli, "shall come and crouch to him for a piece of silver and a morsel of bread, and shall say, Put me, I pray thee, into one of the priest's offices, that I may eat a piece of bread." So again, basically saying there are consequences to your inaction, Eli. And this is one of those we've talked before about, I think I've told you before about the time, I don't even remember what it was that I was supposed to have done, but we got in the car, my family did. I was just, 14 or 15 years old. We got in the car to go somewhere, and my mom, I don't know if some of you had mean moms also, but my mom sometimes would just like fly into this like rage out of nowhere. And I mean, like we get in the car and it's almost like as the door shuts, she comes after me from the front seat to the back. I mean, it always amazed me that this 40-something-year-old woman could talk about back pain and all this pain, but she could come to the back seat like that. I don't know, maybe that was why she had so much back trouble or whatever. But anyway, I mean, she's on me like a hawk on a June bug. And I'm sitting there like trying to like ward off blows. And I said, "I didn't do anything." And she says, "I know, and that's why you're in trouble." And apparently I was supposed to have done something. I was given a task that I didn't do. And I learned very quickly that sometimes there is the sin of doing nothing. Sometimes you say, I didn't do anything. And that's exactly the problem. We talk about sins of commission and sins of omission, right? And so you can mess up by doing wrong, but you can also mess up by failing to do what you were supposed to do. And so that was, my mom got all over me about that. And I was sitting there saying, "I didn't do anything." And she says, "I know, and that's why you're in trouble." So Eli did not restrain his sons. Eli might have been able truthfully to say to God, "Hey, look, God, I'm serving you. I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing." And God says, "Yes, Eli, but you didn't restrain them." We don't know how old they are here, but they're grown. We do know that. This is one of those where I'm not going to pursue it because we just don't have time in this particular context, but it sometimes is difficult to understand and to establish biblically when do the children's responsibilities to, the responsibility to honor parents never ends. We know that, and that's pretty clear. But where does it end to parents being, I don't know if I'd say over their children? It seems that even though children grow and they become adults, and they're gonna have to make some choices. And obviously you can't go and take your 30-something-year-old son, Brother Chris I think he's in Johnny's class, but he could attest to this. It gets kind of hard when they get like Jacob to say, "I'm going to take you in there and turn you over my knee and spank you." I'd really like to see that, though. Sometimes he needs it, right, Miss Tammy? But, it's different, obviously, as children grow up and they become adults. But there is, you read passages like this and you seem to see that there is some kind of a responsibility there. And he says, you you're just inactive here. So probably what is more going on here is that Eli is not really even putting forth that much effort. Obviously, God doesn't expect him to take his son behind the woodshed and whip him the same as he would if this were a boy who had just rebelled against dad and says, I'm going to do what I want anyway. Dave Leonard, my friend down there at West Georgia, and we all know Dave here, but he told me the story of his oldest child, Elijah. And one day, he said, Nikki told him to do something, and he just said no. He was little, but he said no. And he said, I'm sorry, what? No, I'm not going to do that, Daddy. And he said, let me make sure I understand you, son. I'm giving you a chance here. Are you sure about that? And he said, he looked at him, he said, he looked me right in the eye, and he said, I'm sure. And so he said, okay, come on. And so he said, I wore him out. And if you have a strong-willed child, you understand about this. We have one in our house. And he said, how about now, son? Are you ready to do what your mama said to do? And he said, no, sir. So he said, wore him out again. And I mean, this went 2 or 3 times. But, the point was, he said after that, it was like that was our training day. Because after that, he did okay. He was like that stuck with him. Obviously, you're dealing with grown men and women. It's not going to be the same. But to what extent am I trying to correct my child that goes astray, even though he might be 30, 40, even older? Seems like here what happened with Eli is it's just like he's ignoring it. Maybe every now and then he's going, I really wish y'all wouldn't do that. Y'all shouldn't do that. He does say something because, you see that in verses 22, 23, really on down through 25. But he just doesn't seem to be putting forth much effort. Whatever it was, God says, you're not taking action, Eli. And so that's the reason for this removal of the priesthood. His sons are going to die, both of them in one day. Again, we'll see that in chapter 4. That gets us to chapter 3. I guess that's a good stopping point. Was there 2 bells? But I know we're time, so I don't want to start either way because we're right at a chapter break. So be reading chapter 3 and on into 1 Samuel, and we'll pick up there, Lord willing, next week. Again, I'm really enjoying this study. There's a lot going on. We're about to get into the really sections where it really begins to move. We've been in our family Bible time. We've been studying from the life of David. We're a little bit further ahead, but every time we do this with our children for a few minutes before bedtime, sometimes I close the little book we have and I'll tell Reagan and the kids, I'll say, where do you stop when you're talking about the life of David? Because it's boom, 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 so much going on, it's hard to find a good stopping point. But we'll stop there at chapter 3, verse 1. Lord willing, we'll pick up there next Sunday. Thank you very much. We'll have a break before worship.